They tried to sell my pond, the one sitting right behind my house, like it was some shared amenity nobody bothered to tell me about. And they did it quietly, paperwork sliding around behind closed doors, signatures stacking up like it was all perfectly normal. And the worst part wasn't even the sale. It was how confident they were that I wouldn't do a damn thing about it. That's when I decided, if they wanted to sell a pond, they were going to have to explain why it didn't exist anymore. I live just outside a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where mornings come slow and quiet, where you can hear wind moving through trees before you hear another person. 6 acres, mostly woods, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Or at least I thought I understood exactly what mine meant until all this happened. The heart of that land, though, the part that always made it feel like home, was the pond. My grandfather dug it back in the 50s, long before zoning boards and homeowner associations started spreading like weeds across rural counties. He borrowed an old backhoe from a friend, worked it himself for weeks, and by the time he was done, he had carved out something that didn't just hold water, it held history. Growing up, I remember him telling me how stubborn that project was, how the ground fought him every inch, and how that just made him more determined to finish it. That pond wasn't decorative, it wasn't some landscaping feature. It was proof of effort, proof that if you wanted something bad enough, you could build it yourself. By the time the property passed down to me, the pond had settled into itself like it had always been there. About 3/4 of an acre, fed by a natural spring, clear enough that on calm days it looked like a piece of sky had been laid into the earth. Bass swam lazy circles under the surface, frogs kept up their chorus at night, and every now and then a heron would show up like it owned the place. I had a routine without even realizing it was a routine. Wake up, pour coffee, walk down the narrow dirt path from the porch, and just stand there for a minute, sometimes skimming leaves off the surface, sometimes doing nothing at all, just watching the reflection shift with the breeze. It grounded me. It reminded me that not everything had to be rushed, not everything had to be turned into something profitable. Now, a few years back, development started creeping closer. What used to be open land got divided up, and before long, there was a small neighborhood bordering one side of my property. That's when the homeowners association came into existence, and to be clear, I never joined it. My land was recorded separately, clean deed, no covenants, nothing tying me into their rules or decisions. But proximity has a funny way of making people feel entitled, like just because they can see something, they have a say in it. At first, it was little things. People walking a little too close to my tree line, kids wandering farther than they should have, the occasional neighbor waving like we were all part of the same shared space. I didn't make a big deal out of it, just kept to myself, figured it would settle once the novelty wore off. But then came the newsletter. Every month or so, they'd drop one in my mailbox. Even though I wasn't a member, full of updates about landscaping, community plans, and little announcements that never had anything to do with me. Until one day, they did. But I didn't see that part right away. What I saw first was a flag. It was a damp afternoon in early spring, one of those gray days where the air feels heavier than usual, and I was making my usual walk down to the pond when something bright caught my eye near the bank. A survey flag, neon orange, stuck into the ground like a marker. That alone was enough to make me pause. Nobody had any reason to be surveying my land. I walked closer, crouched down, and there it was, a small tag tied to the wire. Parcel 14C. Proposed recreational development. I remember just staring at it for a second, like my brain needed a moment to catch up with what my eyes were reading. Recreational development on my land? That didn't make sense. Not legally, not logically, not in any way that lined up with the paperwork I had locked away in my filing cabinet. I pulled the flag out of the ground right then and there, tossed it aside, but that uneasy feeling didn't go with it. It followed me back up the path, lingered while I sat on the porch, and settled in deeper the more I thought about it. Someone had ordered that survey. Someone had plans. And whatever those plans were, they hadn't bothered to include me. A week later, the confirmation showed up, wrapped in glossy paper and cheerful language. The HOA newsletter. Right there, halfway down the page, under a bold heading about community enhancement opportunities, was a paragraph that made my stomach drop. They were finalizing a deal with a developer, luxury cottages, walking paths, shared water access, and then the line that hit like a punch. Expansion centered around the existing pond area. Existing pond area. They wrote it like it was theirs. like it had always been part of their little neighborhood ecosystem, just waiting to be monetized. I must have read that paragraph 10 times, each pass making it worse instead of clearer. There was no mention of ownership, no acknowledgement that the pond sat entirely within my property lines, just this casual assumption that it was a community asset. And that's when the anger started creeping in, slow at first, then sharper, more focused. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, and I knew exactly who to talk to. Her name was Denise Carter, president of the HOA, the kind of woman who always looked like she had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it even started. I'd seen her around, always composed, always polite in that way that doesn't quite reach the eyes. If there was anyone behind this, it was her. So I went to their next meeting. Didn't RSVP, didn't ask permission, just walked in, took a seat in the back, and waited for my turn. And the whole time, I had that newsletter folded in my pocket and a question sitting right at the front of my mind. How do you sell something that doesn't belong to you? The meeting was held in what used to be a converted barn, all polished wood floors and folding chairs lined up in neat rows. The kind of place meant to feel welcoming, but somehow still carried this quiet sense of control, like every inch of it had been decided by committee. I remember standing near the entrance for a second, just taking it in, watching people chat in low voices, nodding politely at each other, completely unaware, or maybe just unconcerned about what they were about to discuss like it was routine business. Denise was up front, flipping through a binder, calm as ever, like she was hosting a book club instead of managing decisions that could affect people's property. When she saw me, there was a flicker, just a slight pause, a tightening around her eyes, but it disappeared fast. She gave me a polite nod, the kind you give a stranger you don't expect to interact with, and went right back to her notes. The meeting started with the usual stuff, landscaping updates, parking complaints, some discussion about street lighting. All of it dragged out longer than it needed to be. I sat there, quiet, letting it play out, but every minute felt heavier than the last because I knew what was coming. And sure enough, about halfway through, Denise cleared her throat, turned a page, and smiled that same practiced smile. Now, she said, we're excited to share progress on a partnership that's going to significantly enhance property values across the community. That word, partnership, it hung there like it meant something good by default. She went on about a developer, about boutique cottages, walking trails, shared outdoor experiences, all wrapped up in language that made it sound like they were building a resort instead of cutting into land that didn't belong to them. And then she said it again, like it was already a settled fact. The pond area will serve as the centerpiece. That was it. I didn't wait for her to finish. I stood up, and the chair scraped louder than I expected, cutting through the room enough that every head turned in my direction. Denise stopped mid-sentence, her smile freezing in place as she recognized exactly why I was there. Which pond are you talking about? I asked, my voice steady, but there was no softness in it. She tilted her head slightly, like she was confused by the question, or pretending to be. The pond bordering the eastern lots, she said, measured, careful. I took a few steps forward, enough that I wasn't just a voice in the back anymore. You mean the one that sits entirely on my property? That did it. You could feel the shift in the room, quiet conversations dying out, people leaning forward just enough to catch every word. Denise closed her binder slowly, buying herself a second. Well, she said, there seems to be some overlap in how that land has been informally used over the years. Informally used. I almost laughed at that. There's no overlap, I said. There's a deed. There's a boundary line. And that pond is on my side of it. She nodded like she was acknowledging a point in a debate, not a fact. The board has reviewed available documentation, she replied, and the pond has functioned as a shared natural feature within the community footprint. That was when the frustration turned into something sharper. Function, I repeated. You're talking about how people see it, not who owns it. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she shifted, just slightly, into something more assertive. This development is moving forward, she said. It's been approved in principle, and it will benefit everyone involved. Everyone involved. Except me. And you think that gives you the right to sell it? I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. The board has discretion in matters of community planning. That was her answer. Not yes, not no, just a statement that implied authority where there wasn't any. I felt my jaw tighten, and for a second, I considered pushing harder right there, laying everything out in front of everyone. But I stopped myself. Because something about the way she said it, the confidence, the lack of hesitation, it told me this wasn't just a bluff. They had convinced themselves they were in the right. Or worse, they were counting on me not being willing to fight it properly. So instead, I nodded once slow. "All right," I said. "Then I guess we'll see how that works out." And I walked out before the conversation turned into something I couldn't take back. That night, I didn't turn on the TV, didn't sit down, didn't try to distract myself. I went straight to the back room, pulled open the old metal filing cabinet, and started digging through documents I hadn't looked at in years. Property records, permits, correspondence, everything my grandfather had kept, everything that had been passed down along with the land. Paper has a different weight when you actually need it. It's not just information anymore, it's leverage. I found the deed first, right where I expected it, clear as day, outlining the boundaries, the acreage, the exact placement of the pond. No ambiguity, no shared access clauses, nothing that could be twisted into community use. Then I found something better. A drainage easement filed back in the late 70s, approved at the county level, granting full control over water outflow for flood prevention and maintenance. At the time, it probably didn't seem like much, just a practical measure. But reading it now, with everything else in mind, it felt different. It felt like an opening. I kept going, flipping through older permits, and there it was, authorization from the state environmental office allowing controlled drawdown of the pond for upkeep. Seasonal maintenance, sediment control, all perfectly legal, all documented. I leaned back in the chair, papers spread out across the desk, and for the first time since I saw that survey flag, I smiled. Because suddenly, this wasn't about arguing. It wasn't about convincing Denise or the board that they were wrong. It was about showing them. Over the next day, I made a few calls, confirmed what I already suspected, everything checked out. As long as it was done within the permitted guidelines, I had every right to manage the water level however I saw fit. So I went out and rented a pump. 4-inch discharge, industrial grade, louder than anything that had ever touched that pond before. The guy at the rental place didn't ask many questions, just helped me load it up, gave me a quick rundown, and sent me on my way. Setting it up felt methodical, like each step was part of something already decided. I placed it near the southern culvert, ran the hose down the slope, secured everything so it wouldn't shift once it started pulling. The air was still that evening, quiet in a way that made every small sound stand out. The click of connections, the scrape of hose against dirt, my own breathing settling into a steady rhythm. I stood there for a second before turning it on, looking out over the water, watching the surface ripple just slightly in the fading light. Part of me hesitated, not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't reversible in the short term. Once I started, there was no stopping halfway. Then I thought about that meeting, about the way Denise said community asset, like it was already decided. And that hesitation disappeared. I pulled the cord. The engine kicked to life with a rough growl, then steadied into a constant, low rumble. A second later, the hose shuddered, and water began rushing through it, fast and relentless, like it had been waiting for permission to leave. I watched it for a while, arms crossed, feeling something settle into place inside me. They wanted to sell a pond. Fine, let's see how they handle it, when there's nothing left to sell. Once that pump started, it didn't stop. Not for a break, not for second thoughts, not even when the nights got colder and the sound of that engine carried farther than I expected through the trees. It just kept going, steady and mechanical, like a clock counting down towards something nobody else quite realized was happening yet. The first day, you wouldn't have noticed much unless you knew exactly where to look. Maybe the waterline sitting a little lower against the rocks, maybe the shallows stretching just a bit farther out than usual. But I noticed. Every few hours, I'd walk down there, coffee in hand in the morning, flashlight at night, just watching the level drop inch by inch, like time made visible. By the second day, it was obvious. The edge of the pond had pulled back enough to expose the darker band of soil that hadn't seen air in years, slick and heavy, footprints sinking deep if you stepped too close. The frogs had gone quiet, or at least quieter, and the fish started moving differently, tighter circles, like they could feel something changing even if they didn't understand it. I remember standing there that evening, hands in my pockets, listening to the pump hum behind me, and thinking, This is what taking control actually looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, just consistent. Word started to spread around the neighborhood sometime on day 3. I noticed it in small ways at first. A car slowing down near the edge of my property, someone standing a little longer than usual by the tree line, 2 neighbors talking in low voices and glancing toward the water. Nobody came up to me directly, at least not yet, but you could feel the curiosity turning into concern. The pond wasn't just a view anymore. It was changing, and that made people uncomfortable. That evening, I got my first knock. It was a guy named Mark, lived 2 houses down from the edge of my land, friendly enough in passing, the kind of neighbor who waves but doesn't linger. He stood on my porch, shifting his weight like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be there. "Hey," he said, nodding toward the back. "You, doing some work down there?" I leaned against the doorframe, followed his glance for a second, then looked back at him. "Maintenance," I said. "Perfectly legal." He hesitated, scratched the back of his neck. "Right? Yeah, I figured. It's just, people are talking. Something about the development deal, and they should probably read their paperwork more carefully." I cut in, not harsh, but not inviting either. He gave a small, awkward laugh, like he didn't want to pick a side. "Yeah, well, just thought I'd check." "Appreciate it," I said, and that was enough for him to take the hint. By day 4, Denise showed up. Not at the pond, not where things were actually happening, but at my front door, like she could keep the conversation on neutral ground if she stayed far enough from the problem. She was dressed the same as always, composed, controlled, but there was something tighter in her posture now, something less certain. "I think we need to talk," she said, skipping the pleasantries. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, gave her my full attention. "About what?" I asked, even though we both knew. She took a breath, measured. "The water level," she said. "It's affecting the presentation of the property." I almost smiled at that presentation. "You mean the pond?" I said. "The one you were planning to sell?" Her expression flickered, just slightly. "We're in the middle of a contractual process," she replied. "Any significant alteration could be considered interference." I let that sit for a second, then shook my head. "No," I said. "What you're in the middle of is trying to sell something you don't own. What I'm doing is managing my property. Big difference." Her tone sharpened. "This doesn't have to become adversarial." I tilted my head. "It already is." There it was, the line neither of us was pretending didn't exist anymore. She exhaled slowly, recalibrating. "Look," she said, softer now. "There's a lot of money tied up in this. A lot of expectations. If you just pause whatever you're doing, we can revisit the details, make sure everyone benefits." Everyone benefits. That phrase again. I stepped a little closer, not aggressive, just enough to make the point clear. "You didn't come to me before," I said. "You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You just decided. And now that it's not going your way, you want to talk about fairness?" She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. So I nodded once, stepped back. "Have a good evening, Denise." And I went back inside. By day 6, the pond wasn't really a pond anymore. It was something else, something stripped down to its bones. The water had receded so far that what used to be the center was now a wide stretch of exposed clay, cracked and curling at the edges like it had aged years in a matter of days. The remaining water pooled in uneven pockets, shallow, murky, reflecting the sky in broken fragments instead of a single clean surface. And that was the day the buyers came. I didn't know the exact time they'd show up, but I had a pretty good idea of when inspections usually happened, so I made sure I was there, not hiding, not watching from a distance, just standing near the edge, coffee in hand like any other morning. Like this was all perfectly ordinary. 2 SUVs pulled up along the road, doors opening in that synchronized way that tells you this isn't casual. 3 people stepped out, dressed like they were ready to evaluate something valuable, clipboards, sunglasses, that quiet confidence that comes with expecting things to go according to plan. Then they saw it. You could actually watch the moment it hit them, the pause, the confusion, the quick glance between each other like maybe they'd come to the wrong place. One of them walked closer, shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground, and muttered something under his breath that didn't sound polite. "This is the site?" another one asked. I took a sip of coffee, let a second pass. "Depends what you were expecting," I said. They looked at me then, really looked, trying to place who I was in the equation. "Where's the water?" one of them asked. like it might just be hidden somewhere out of sight. I gestured loosely toward the pump, still running, still doing exactly what it had been doing for days. Maintenance drawdown, I said, perfectly within my rights. That word "my" landed exactly where it needed to. One of them frowned, flipped through his notes. Your rights. I nodded. My property. Silence. Then a string of quiet, tense conversation between them, voices low but urgent, the kind of tone that means something has gone very wrong, very quickly. One of them pulled out a phone, stepped aside, already dialing, probably the developer, probably someone higher up who was now hearing about a missing centerpiece. Within 20 minutes, they were gone. No measurements, no photos, no further questions. Just gone. The pump kept running. 2 days later, the news made its way back around. The deal had collapsed. Breach of contract. Penalties. Numbers thrown around that made people suddenly very interested in how all of this had been handled in the first place. Turns out when you promise something you don't actually control, it tends to catch up with you. Denise resigned not long after that. No big announcement, no dramatic exit, just a quiet note in the next newsletter about leadership transition, like that would smooth it over. And then things got quiet again. The pump came off, the hoses were rolled up, and over the next couple months, the pond did what it had always done. It filled itself back in. Spring-fed, patient, steady, no rush, no concern for what had happened before. By the time summer settled in, the water was back, clear as ever, surface smoothing out until it looked like nothing had ever disturbed it. But I knew. Every morning, I still walked that same path, coffee in hand, same as always, but there's a difference now. Not in the land, not in the water, in the understanding of it. Ownership isn't just paperwork. It's attention. It's boundaries. It's being willing to act when something crosses a line. Sometimes I stand there a little longer than I used to, watching the reflection settle, thinking about how close it came to being turned into something else entirely. And I'll admit, there's a part of me that wonders how it all looked from the outside. Did I go too far? Was it justified? Or was it just effective? Because at the end of the day, the pond is still here, exactly where it's supposed to be. So I'll leave that up to you. If you were in my place, would you have done the same thing, or would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments, because I've heard arguments both ways, and I'm curious where you land.